Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Live from the Table. I'm here today to do a special interview, and I'm excited about this with John Spencer. Now, I'm going to read your whole bio here and normally I rush through bios, but this bio is so impressive and so important to the credibility of this conversation. I want to take the time to read it. John Spencer is an award-winning scholar, professor, author, combat veteran, national security military analyst, and internationally recognized expert and advisor on urban warfare, military strategy, tactics, and other related topics. Considered one of the world's leading experts on urban warfare, if not the leading expert, he served as an advisor to the top four-star general and other senior leaders in the U.S. Army as part of strategic research groups from the Pentagon to the United States Military Academy. He served 2 combat tours during the Iraq War. He's the author of 3 books: Understanding Urban Warfare, Connected Soldiers, Life, Leadership, and Social Connections in Modern War, winner of the 2023 Gold Medal Award, Best Military History Memoir, Military Writers Society of America, the Mini Manual for the Urban Defender, translated into 10 languages. His writings have appeared in Time Magazine, New York Times, USA Today, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, LA Times, New York Daily News, Wired Magazine, Politico, The Hill, Foreign Policy Magazine, Defense One, Army Magazine, and other publications. Spencer is also a regular military analyst and commentator for CNN, MSNBC, Fox, BBC, and numerous news and media organizations. Welcome to the show, John Spencer.
No, thanks, and thanks for reading all that.
That must make you that's an accomplishment. That's a life's accomplishment right there.
I mean, I've had an amazing career from a 16-year-old boy from Indiana joining the military, 25 years to, advising 4-star generals. And interesting, after I retired, I can also say that I'm probably the only person you're going to meet who's been into many of the places that we talk about. So I went to Nagorno-Karabakh. I went to Ukraine 4 times since the war started, and I've been into Gaza. So I don't know how many of your guests have been into Gaza since the war began, but
None.
I just got back in February.
Can I ask you, before we get into all this stuff, it came out in our little messaging on Twitter that you have 3 young kids. You're a single dad. I have 3 kids. I was raised by a single dad. And I mean, this is a deep question. Now that you're a dad and you can imagine your kids growing up, volunteering for the military, perhaps dying for their country, how has that changed you? Would you want to see your children volunteering for the armed forces? What are your thoughts on all that?
Sure. I mean, I of course want them to have a strong moral, ethical code, and I've spent a lot of my time as a parent on that, on who we are. My son remembers when I was teaching at West Point and being around the cadets and attending football games. I, of course, think that any amount of service would do them great benefits as growing into adults, getting that perspective of the world, of what it means to serve, what it means to have a community, and all of our freedoms. That it is backed by sacrifice. It is backed by commonality, and serving the community, not just being in it. So I would be honored, but I also want to give them as much information so they make that decision. I would strongly encourage them to serve in some way. You don't have to serve in the military, right? Because all the police and the firemen and community leaders, there's many ways to serve, but I think it's a integral part of our society and our power.
So when you write, I think this is a fair interpretation of what you've written, that you believe Israel is doing the right thing. That includes, it must, your idea that, well, if you were a citizen there and it meant your son going off to fight in this war, you would think this was the right thing for the country to do. And there they have no choice to call your son and have your son's life risked for this cause.
100%. I mean, how do you value the survival of the nation and of your people than sending your blood and treasure to defend that right? And literally something that, again, because I've had to travel the world and I try to express that to my kids. I mean, we live in a great United States where that actual existential threat outside of nuclear weapons hasn't visited our borders in a very, very long time, but there are so many people around the world, from Ukraine to Israel and many other places, who face an existential threat of they're fighting for their families to their rear. They're fighting for each other. And I say this in my Connected Soldiers book, like why soldiers fight. It isn't for, I mean, in some parts it is for your nationality, for tribe and things like that, but it's really for the people to the left, the right, and the people behind them.
So this is one of the problems I think we as Americans have in judging what's going on over there, is that we live in our prosperous 2024 country with really nothing real to worry about, misgendering and things like that. These are the issues that we, and Israel's living in essentially 1944. That's really where they're living, and we just can't identify with that in some way. I think that's the disconnect, right?
100%. I mean, people fear what they do not understand, and I mean, so many people haven't had hadn't had the opportunity to visit Israel, to visit every corner and understand the complexity of the Israel Palestine issue, to understand even October 7th. And I had to go there. I didn't understand it. I had to go and walk the ground to really understand the magnitude of it and what it was, and to see Gaza 2 miles away or less if you're in some of those kibbutzim that were attacked. People can't understand that because you, like you said, it's like a cognitive hurdle for them to even be able to put themselves in anybody else's shoes, but just to understand what's going on. And this is, again, where people have looked at the war as something just so, in their mind, they can't comprehend how war works, how this war is so unique. And I know a lot of veterans who just can't put it into their mental framework of what type of war this is and how foreign it is to anything they've experienced. There's so much unknown that has caused people to fear this, to just want it to stop. So many angles.
Yeah, I sometimes get mad and I'm arguing in our restaurant, the Olive Tree, and I tell people, and this is not to say that what I'm about to say means that Israel is right. It's just a necessary first step for people to even consider it. I say, we're here in Manhattan. Imagine this is all happening right over the East River in Queens. And by the way, Brooklyn is evacuated until further notice because nobody can live there safely. Like, would America give up Brooklyn until further notice and sustain incoming rocket fire endlessly from Queens? Even if we had something to knock the rockets, most of them out of the air, but we'd spend our lives in and out of bomb shelters. Who would live that way? And that, again, that's not to say therefore Israel is right, but I think many of the people who have already come to a conclusion about that haven't even stopped to consider it through those eyes. That's the problem.
Right. And they almost discount you when you say that, right? Like,
Yeah.
what would we do? Right. And I've faced this, and I have my very strong opinion based on years, a decade of research into this type of combat. But even the former Joint Chief of Staff, General Milley, this very recently said, "What do you think America would have done?" Again, following all laws of war, even humanity, which is one of the laws of war, right? You do everything physically possible to prevent civilian harm. But if you think America would have done something different in a similar context in any way, you're actually right. It would have been much more overwhelming force to accomplish the goals immediately. And I think people don't, some people are anti-war. I got that. Some people disagree with everything the U.S. military has ever done in its history. I get that. But anybody with actual logic, when a nation is attacked, like at that scale, you know that a nation has the right of self-defense and to pursue the goals that any nation would, to include the United States, who has much more military force, but also trying to bring the war to an end as quickly as possible. If anybody's reasonable, they would know that's a goal. And then they, like, known, like you said, that they don't want to, they can't factor in, like, what if this was on our border, right? The southern border, whatever border. Okay, fine. You
Mm-hmm.
can't count that. Let me tell you the military challenge that is, if you would give me that, yes, the United States would attack Hamas because of this, this 9/11, 9/11 stuff. But then you think that the United States militarily would do it differently. is not backed up on anything that we've ever done in our history.
Yeah. Well, and then one more thing, and I have a lot here to ask you about, but part of, I think, the problem that people don't want to admit, in my opinion, is that in order to go down that road that you're talking about, you have to first accept that Israel is a real and legitimate country with the same rights that the United States has. And for many, many, many people, even those who may not realize it, they don't quite see Israel as a real country. In other words, if I said, what if London had to evacuate? They wouldn't even spend 2 seconds. Of course, if London has to evacuate, England has to do whatever is necessary to bring people back. But somehow Israel is considered somehow differently. Kissinger, I've talked about it on this show before. I've been reading his book, Diplomacy, excerpts of it. And one of the things he spoke about was that the West felt so uneasy about the Treaty of Versailles that it didn't have the moral courage to be strong with Germany because they somehow felt that it wasn't fair, and it was like it was a cancer on their conscience. And I think that there's an analogy here to Israel. People think somehow, in some way, Israel is just not entitled to be considered exactly like the United States of America. And if it were, this would be much easier for people to come to grips with.
Yeah, I mean, there's just so many topics involving Israel that tap into a crisis, I think, in people's ability to critically think. Even how would you begin to understand the Israel Palestinian conflict, despite you don't know anything about it? You just have these feelings of bits of information you got together. But I agree with you, that includes Israel's right to be a nation, of its borders, of the
Right.
challenges, of the history of it. Um, you quoting the Churchill reminds me of the Auschwitz letter, where the Jews sent a letter to the United States asking to intervene and to bomb Auschwitz, and they said no. And from the time that letter was sent until the camp was liberated, it could have saved tens of thousands of Jews. But we made a decision that that wasn't in pursuant to the military strategy.
The hot topic this morning and kind of yesterday is that the UN seems to be reassessing the number of people who have died in Gaza. It's still being argued out. I had made the argument on this show, a few arguments about the casualty issue, trying to put them out there. I've been saying all along that every day Israel wakes up and has military decisions to make, and because Israel's fighting a military war with a military objective, and Hamas is fighting a PR war. And the most consequential decision they make every day is to announce the casualty counts. So why in the world would we think that they would ever be honest about these death counts? It makes no sense for them to do so. The only reason would be because they're honest. But obviously, to attribute that kind of honor to the people who committed October 7th is absurd. So it just seems, for very, very pure, easy to understand, common sense reasons, the numbers can't be right. And then we had an empirical case where there was that bombing at the Christian hospital, alleged bombing, and they announced that 471 people had died. I think that was the number. And then a few days later, we find out that the hospital wasn't even bombed. So there you are. They're caught red-handed. Where did you get this 471 number from? You made it up. So are we to think that that's the only time you made it up, was the time that we caught you? That can't be right. And finally, we would hear that in the past, the health ministry numbers have been close to accurate. And that's a real argument. But it occurred to me that, and you'll answer that, since those conflicts were so small comparatively, there was only so much exaggeration that could go on. And here, the scale of the conflict is so large. They have open road to put whatever numbers out that they want, and nobody would know any better. So having said all that, I think maybe I was right about a bunch of that stuff. What can you tell us about the numbers, your opinion of it, and why the UN has reassessed it?
Yeah, one again, somebody who studied urban wars, urban battles,
Mm-hmm.
for a very long time, all of them, to include all the ones the United States has been involved with. Um, yeah, there's a reason that the Second Battle of Fallujah, 2004, was the biggest battle of the entire Iraq War. And that includes against actually the Battle of Baghdad, which is close to 6 million people. But this small city of 300,000 in Fallujah was the biggest battle of the entire Iraq War. And why the Battle of Mosul in 2017 was the biggest battle of World War II. Because the enemy drives the situation of defending the dense urban terrain, using human shields, all these aspects, and having an understanding. There's never been a battle or a war where anybody has ever been able to tell you what the daily civilian casualty count is. So from October until now, I've of course said that like that number, I can tell you with very strong confidence that number is wrong. Even if we were in this anti trust, don't trust anybody world, right? Don't trust the government, don't trust these people, don't trust those people. I'm telling you, in any type of war, especially an urban centric war, it would be impossible to know how many people are dying in the war. And that, so let's start at the end of what you just said. The Gaza
Okay.
Health Ministry has been accurate in previous wars. Well, that's both a truth and a lie. The truth is that after the war, yes, the number that the Gaza Health Ministry said after the war was close to what the UN questionably also said the number was. It wasn't during the war. Like,
I see.
actually, in the past, like in the Battle of Jenin, when they said hundreds had died during the war, and the media was running with it, and then it come to find out it was, it wasn't in the hundreds. That's both a truth and a lie. That's the world we live in. So even if I took the number, it wouldn't tell the story that everybody wants to say, which is to imply without evidence that Israel, without being on the ground, without ever spending time with the IDF, without knowing how war works, to know that that number is not accurate. Because even if I took the Hamas Gaza Health Ministry number of 35,000 Palestinians dead, I would have to get whoever the person I'm talking to is to acknowledge that that's every death that's happened in October 7th, no matter what the cause. If it was true, it would have to be every Hamas fighter, every combatant who attacked the IDF, because there's more than just Hamas. It would be every person who died of natural causes, every person who died by Hamas's hands, because of the 13,000 rockets that Hamas has launched at Israel, every one of them a war crime because they were targeting civilian areas. 20% of those have landed inside of Gaza and killed a lot of Palestinian people. But let's say we took the number, it still wouldn't tell the number that the narrative everybody wants to say. But yes, as of recently, both the Gaza Health Ministry, before the UN in the last over the weekend said anything, the Gaza Health Ministry put out a note on Telegram saying there's about 11,000 people that we can't confirm are dead. If because nobody asked how does the Gaza Health Ministry, because they're not involved in wars. They don't know how people come up with casualty numbers. That the Gaza Health Ministry comes up with a number by, of course, hospital records of people coming into the hospital, but that's actually a low percentage. They also use social media reports of missing personnel.
Well, to be fair, the hospitals are many are destroyed, right? So
No, there's only one that's actually would be
okay.
considered destroyed, Shifa Hospital. Other than that, every hospital has had an operation conducted against it because Hamas was using it. But the only one that could be severely damaged was Shifa when we had that second battle where 1,000 Hamas members who were called out wouldn't, and they had this big battle over it. Now, we've actually destroyed hospitals by airstrikes in like the Battle of Mosul when ISIS was using them. But thus far, outside of the Shifa hospital, the hospitals are not destroyed. Matter of fact, all the hospitals are in some functioning capability, and there's been 10 field hospitals set up on top of those.
Okay.
So, but of the number, right? If you understand how the Gaza Health Ministry, for some reason during this war alone, right? So the taglines: 35,000 dead, 13,000 children dead, which even Hamas never said in the Gaza Health Ministry by name list, to include 11,000 incomplete. Like we don't know if that person is actually missing or not. It's just on our list. On their list, there are not 13,000 children dead. Even if I went with the UN provided number of 18 years old, means anything below 18 and below would mean a child. I joined the military at 16, was off to basic training by 17. But even the Hamas never said there were 13,000, but that seems to be the chant of every uninformed person of the world. 13,000 children dead. How could this be legal? How could this not be intentional? Easy. One, it's not the number. And yes, over the weekend, the United Nations said that because of the fog of war, so back to that urban warfare, you would never be able to know. that the number was dropped from 13,000 down to 7,000, like 800. And of those numbers, now they're saying, well, about 10 to 11,000 of the people that we can't track are probably under the rubble because of urban combat. Yeah, that's what they're saying.
How would they know that they're under the rubble? They're missing.
Right. So somebody on social media or a family who says, we don't know where this person is. So he immediately goes on the roster of dead under the rubble, he or she.
But do you think there's actually a factual trail to that, or do they just make it up? That's because, why wouldn't they just make it up? I mean, as a matter of fact, if I were on their side and I thought their cause was morally just, I would advise them to make it up. I don't even mean it as a criticism. I mean, you're fighting for your lives here. This is your battle. You're not going to say the truth, even if it's going to ruin you.
No, I mean, every civilian casualty in this war has been a travesty. But for Hamas, it's a strategy. Hamas's strategy has never been to defeat the IDF, right? It's never been even to hold the terrain, which is, as a war guy, you got to think about the strategy. The Hamas strategy since October 8th has been to force the world, mainly the United States, who in the past has stopped Israel in defending itself. Hamas's strategy has been to force the United States to get the IDF to stop on their goals and for Hamas to achieve a massive political victory. And that strategy at times has been working. And the main vehicle of that strategy has been the number of civilians dead. So, of course, I would trump that number up as well in any way possible, to the point where our leaders around the world have run with the number and not even put the caveats on it, like this is from the Gaza Health Ministry, or this is every death in Gaza, according to the Gaza Health Ministry. We just say, I actually have a headline very recently from AP that says 35,000 Palestinians killed by Israeli airstrikes in Gaza.
Mm-hmm.
Like, well, that's a lie. I mean, Hamas doesn't even say that. But that's the news headline. And then you have literally world leaders saying it without the caveats. So it's like everybody's fallen into the Hamas trap, the Hamas strategy.
The other question is, why are so many civilians dying? Can you, or why would they be dying? Can you rehearse for us the measures that Israel has taken to evacuate areas and explain why there would still be so many civilians in those areas? So I had a naive thought. If I were a parent in Gaza, it's a small area. You can walk from any point in Gaza to another point can be walked to in a day by a able-bodied person. It's not as if you have to trek like these poor people who come from South and Central America and they walk thousands of miles to get to America. This is 20 miles in any direction. If I was a parent there, I think, well, I'll just take my kids to the beach. I'm just going to go right to the beach where they're probably not going to bomb the beach and wait this out as best I can. But they don't do that. So what has Israel done to try to get people to evacuate, and why is it not more successful?
So the way that Israel has gone approaching evacuating the urban areas, right, which is the greatest, what we call civilian harm mitigation step that any military can do, although it also cedes a lot of strategy to the enemy, right? So if in any evasion, right, you have to recognize that this was enemy held territory. The IDF invaded to achieve their three goals: penetrated, move forward to attack. Not all militaries in the past, not the United States in the invasion of Afghanistan, Iraq, Panama, North Korea, you name it, provided warning and evacuated cities because you want to move with overwhelming speed and surprise the enemy before he gets embedded and entrenched and using human shields. So how do you do it? If that's the route you go, number one is you announce evacuations. The number one tactic that any military has used, and these are recent tactics, right? This called civilian harm mitigation, is to drop flyers. Mm-hmm. That's what we did in the Second Battle of Fallujah, the Battle of Mosul, others. You drop flyers, and then you try to communicate in any way, whether it's social media, in other ways, trying to communicate to the civilians to leave. You have to establish safe corridors. and a place for them to go. Those are kind of the standard techniques. Now, Israel, because again, it's a unique, and this is 2 miles from the border, and they take different steps. They also put hundreds of soldiers in phone banks and called into the cities to reach anybody they could, a religious leader, a business leader, families, direct to families, calling them and saying, this area is is going to be a combat area. Please evacuate for your safety. Go to this route, take this road, go to this area. And the numbers are crazy. If the millions of phone calls, the text messages, the pre-recorded voicemails, but to say it's not effective, and you also have to wait, right? You have to give time for civilians to evacuate. So in northern Gaza, in October, November, there were 1 million people north of the river that splits Gaza. And of those, the New York Times said that Israel successfully evacuated 850,000 of those million. So it's like 85%, right? And they waited 3 weeks. Israel waited 3 weeks before launching their ground invasion to allow for the evacuation. But on top of that step, so that's kind of normal. They also do roof knocking, which everybody wants to discount, but they actually will call a building before they strike a building, call everybody in it and say, look, this is a military target. We're going to strike this building in an hour or 30 minutes, and please evacuate. And if they don't, they drop munitions on top of the roof, and it's called roof knocking. Israel is also, as the world and as this strategy of Hamas to use human shields, to use human sacrifice, because they themselves, the leaders of Hamas, have gone on TV and said, we want as many of our people to die as possible to achieve our political goal. Israel also started handing out their military maps. So they make this map where they cut up the city into small areas and number each city, number each building. Israel started handing out their maps and then communicating to the civilians, okay, in this area of the city, 201, we will be conducting operations. Please evacuate. If you're not in this area, please stay away. Nobody's ever done that before. Israel has deployed drones with speakers on them. They've deployed speakers on parachutes. They continue the phone calls. Israel has done hundreds of daily pauses. So every day, to include the height, and everybody keeps comparing the war in Gaza to October, when there were 40,000 embedded Hamas defenders in tunnels that no military has ever faced. Which, oh, by the way, if I was a father in Gaza and there was a tunnel under my house, that's where I'd put my children as I was trying to keep them protected. And without question, 100% of the entire population of Gaza, the 2.2 million, could fit with ease in the 400 plus miles of Hamas tunnels underneath every urban area there. And not one, actually, there's only been about 5 civilians allowed in a Hamas tunnel, and those are the families of Yahya Sinwar.
But aren't the tunnels part of the targets? With the 2,000-pound bombs, aren't they trying to destroy the tunnels?
Yes. So that's one of the greatest criticisms somehow, because if the number doesn't work, is how many 2,000-pound bombs Israel has dropped. So yes, that's what the 2,000-pound bombs that everybody criticizes are used for, are to penetrate. I'm just saying you could stick your family in the tunnels. It's better than them if you're not going to evacuate.
If you're not going to evacuate.
Yeah. But some of those tunnels are not reachable by bombs. Some of those tunnels are over 200 feet underground. And yes, why does a 500-pound bomb not achieve the goal of a 2,000-pound bomb? Is because a 500-pound bomb doesn't penetrate the earth as much as a 2,000-pound penetrating bunker busting munition. And for some reason, that's been the other criticism, Noam, is like, okay, I don't agree with that they tried to evacuate civilians. I don't agree they were effective, because here's the number that we also agreed isn't real. Here's the number of civilians that have died, so it doesn't matter. They haven't been effective. That's not true. Even the New York Times said by December, the IDF had cut the civilian casualties in half. By January, they had cut it to 2/3. And by the time I visit in February, it's so low that they're not tracking it. They're actually aggregating the civilian casualties on a daily basis. They're not talking about, on this day, this is how many civilians were reported dead.
Now, what about those cases that were reported? And I would say that a small number of these cases goes a long way in terms of the implications. that it might have to reasonable people who were evacuating, that some of the corridors then got hit. Some of the places they were told to evacuate to were also hit. How do we process all that?
Sure. One, the reports. I don't deny them, and I think it happens. So the safe routes, like the Al Sadin Road that goes from north to south, even the Al Mawasi humanitarian zone, which is the massive humanitarian zone along on that coastline, like you said, where it was identified by the IDF as the one place that they think that the Hamas had not dug tunnels, had not prepared defenses. In both those locations, along the road and exactly right against the Al Mawasi humanitarian zone, Hamas set up rocket launchers and launched rockets. So, has there been IDF strikes near humanitarian safe zones? Absolutely. And I believe those reports are true because of the fact that Hamas is using them as a shield
Mm-hmm.
to basically create an area that is, no matter what happens, it's a no-go area, is exactly what's led Hamas to the strategy of building itself underneath the civilians. It's called human shield strategy. To say that the routes there's nowhere safe to go, I agree with that, but there is safer places to go. And yes, on those routes, the IDF, yes, there have been, but nobody talks about the IDF actually putting soldiers during those 4-hour daily pauses along that road to protect the Palestinian people as they try to evacuate. Where I have other reports where IDF is shooting people that are trying to evacuate. Not the IDF, but the Hamas.
So I guess what you're saying is that there's some corridor that's set up, and then Hamas shoots some rockets from that corridor, and
Yes.
then the IDF feels it has to retaliate. But might not it be better for the IDF simply not to retaliate at those targets because it's more important that the evacuation be unimpeded?
Right. Absolutely. And this is the one we don't have every report, although IDF gives some, where they look at the target and they make that
Mm-hmm.
proportionality assessment. Okay, that's a military target. It's a valid military target. It's a Hamas commander in a bunker underneath a civilian building. Or there's
Right.
a rocket launching site actively launching rockets right now, but it is close to hundreds of civilians. So they'll make that assessment on military advantage, military target against the expected civilian casualty collateral damage. That's the requirement by law. And if in that situation, if you're saying that that rocket next to it, but nobody know, again, when we talk about it in hindsight of the report, well, here they attacked near this humanitarian zone, near this safe route. Well, how many civilians, if they did take an action, were killed in that operation? And is that disproportionate to the value, like you said? Now, if you're saying don't take the action because it will be perceived as too risky, well, that's the issue. Is what is the information that the IDF had at the moment? How many civilians were near it? What was the expected collateral damage, and what is the risk to not taking this shot? Those are all factors that everybody discounts on the report of in of the 6 months of the war. There has been no safe area to evacuate. That's not true, or the overwhelming numbers of people that actually did successfully evacuate, it wouldn't have been achieved. Right? There's nowhere safe to go.
Well, it's interesting. You're talking about the issue of proportionality from the point of view of proper protection of the people being bombed. But I'm also looking at, and obviously very, very important, but I'm also looking at it in terms of what's the best strategy for Israel the if the consequence of bombing the corridor is not just the number of civilians that are going to be killed in the corridor, but then also the number of civilians who are now scared to evacuate end up getting killed somewhere else. The consequence of the world having gasoline for its turn against Israel. All these things come from that. Look, anybody who listens to my show understands that I'm quite pro-Israel. I'm trying both to be a good journalist here and as I would as a patriotic citizen of America, I would never assume America's making no mistakes. You have to assume that mistakes are always made, and in hindsight, you can see them. One of the actually, this would be a question. Given everything we know now about the way the world has turned against Israel and how that is really uh, uh, making Israel fight of the war very, very difficult, if not impossible. What would Israel have done differently if it had known this timeline, going back to October 7th now? How would it have fought the war differently to avoid the situation that it's in now, yet still be true to its goals?
Yeah, it's hard to going back in hindsight because both sides get a vote, right?
Mm-hmm.
Hamas get a vote, Israel gets a vote in the approach. I strongly believe. Again, I'm not pro-Israel. I'm actually pro-truth,
Mm-hmm.
and I go there to do research, not to listen to what I'm told, to observe from my own eyes and to assess in as objective way as possible Israel's actions against the military challenge and compare it with my knowledge to every battle that anybody who actually follows the law of war, right? We can't compare it against Russia and Ukraine. We can't compare it against Russia and Chechnya, the Syrians and the Syrians, because none of those people follow the laws of war. But I can compare it objectively to every battle and war in which these are the military challenges. In hindsight, I think that the IDF would have gone in like us to achieve the goal as quickly as possible while still doing everything feasible, reasonable, and possible to prevent civilian casualties, although that's the Hamas strategy. This gets to the hypothesis that Israel has listened to the world because of it knows that it lives in this world where it's held to a second, third, crazy standard that no military has ever been held in war because it's Israel. Acknowledge that. I might not agree with it, but objectively, I acknowledge that because I've
Mm-hmm.
studied every battle to include the ones that we've been involved with, like the Battle of Mosul. But Israel listened to the world. Israel reduced its forces. It started with 5 divisions. It attacked on October, late October with 4 divisions. It quickly was told by the world and by the United States, like, I don't. You have to change your tactics. You have to bomb less. You have to use less forces, and you have to reduce the civilian casualty count. Although we don't know what it is, you just got to reduce it. So they did that. They went from 4 divisions to 3 divisions to 2 divisions to 1 division to 1 brigade. And Hamas has survived to this point. We can talk about how effective they've been, but the world and the United States owns some of the suffering that has happened in Gaza. Because if you end a war quicker, there is less of this. This is the hypothesis, and I'll argue again. And I think you've had guests on the show who said, we just wouldn't have bombed as much. We wouldn't have used as many 2,000-pound bombs to hit the tunnels. The fallacy. There's 2 fallacies here, Noam. One is that if you bomb less, there'll be less destruction. Well, if anybody's ever studied high intensity urban combat, where a single group of soldiers can turn a single building into a week long battle, if without the ability to bomb. All right, this is MacArthur in Manila, MacArthur in the Battle of Seoul. No air power. You get a very destructive building to building battle where you have to use artillery, mortars. It's actually a fallacy to believe if you bomb less, it'll lead to less destruction and less civilian casualties. The other fallacy, because the other libel or inaccuracy has been Israel has used more unguided munitions than other people have in past, although nobody has faced this level of a combatant in urban terrain. The other fallacy is that if you just had all precision guided munitions, there would be less collateral damage, less civilian casualties. And again, that's not backed up by history of any similar battle. Think about the Second Battle of Fallujah, Battle of Way, 1968, Battle of Mosul. I can precisely hit the building, but the enemy combatant is driving where the fighting is happening in every building along that block, and to leading to more destruction. But they're both fallacies.
What you're saying reminds me of something I think about a lot, which is that some situations just have no good outcomes. I use a silly example, when you have a kid who's behaves really badly. Um, People will look at that kid and then they will look at how he was raised and then they will find, oh, you did this wrong, you did that wrong, because it had to be the way you raised that kid. But if that kid had been adopted by some other family, the kid might very well have still been, had just had a bad disposition. And if he was raised in an opposite way, so you shouldn't have done that, you shouldn't have done that. But the fact is, there was no right answer. I sometimes think that in the Iraq War, if we hadn't gone into Iraq, now we'd be saying that all the people who told us not to go into Iraq were so wrong, because it would have turned out terribly one way or another. And I would just
Yeah,
have to imagine.
yeah.
Go ahead. You can interrupt
Yeah,
me.
no, I agree. I mean, this is the frustrating part with revisionist history of people that study wars and battles, even if they were involved, and they disagree with everything about it, every reason, and they discount the information that people have at the moment.
If you're fighting an enemy like Hamas, who knows that it has to get its own people killed, they will have the ingenuity and the cleverness to figure out how to do that in whatever scenario they're presented with, and Israel will always look bad. That's what I fear is the truth. I don't want to be callous. I mean, I have to be open to listening to it. No, if they had done this and this and this, think about it, Noam. They could have accomplished it, and these people wouldn't have been killed. I have to be ready to listen to that. But my
Yeah,
gut is that wouldn't happen. Go ahead.
yeah. Let me give you. So that's the alternatives, right? What do you think, given all the history of warfare, it was a better strategy or better actions that the IDF could have done? Okay, bomb less. Okay, I can show you how that could have led to just the same, if not more, amounts of destruction. Because now you have IDF soldiers having to close the distance to that building being held by the enemy and attempt to get them out of that building. And no military in the history of warfare has faced a combatant who spent 15 years and $1 billion digging 400 miles of tunnels underneath every bit of urban terrain in an entire area. The fallacy is there was still another way, right? This is I wrote a Wall Street Journal article that beginning in October there were people recommending to Israel not to launch a ground invasion, that they would lose too many soldiers, it's not possible, et cetera, and they should do strategic raids and strategic bombing, which is a counterinsurgency, counterterrorism fallacy. I call it the zero dark 30 fallacy because General McMaster did. One, that would have to hold in time that, okay, you have to let your 242 hostages stay in captivity indefinitely. You just have to let them. It would be too destructive if you did not just let them stay in captivity, to include babies to Holocaust survivors. You would have to leave Hamas in power. You would have to leave Hamas launching rockets at you. And we don't know how many they have, but you can shoot most of those out of the sky. There is no historical backing to the ideal that just doing strategic raids, gathering the intelligence to find the leaders, gathering the intelligence to find the hostile, and then penetrate that hostile area to do very precision operations. There is no history of military history that says that would have achieved the goals in any relative time, like literally years, it would take you to gather the intelligence to drive you to that. If you could do an operation like that into enemy held territory and leaving them continue to launch rockets and develop capabilities, it is the fallacy of the alternative. And I'm saying, yes, there is an alternative. You could have gone in stronger, quicker, while still evacuating urban areas of civilians and achieved your goal as quickly as possible. But that isn't tolerable to people. Like, war is not tolerable right now because people don't understand even the variables of what's going on in Gaza, of the challenge of 40,000 armed defenders who cannot be convinced to give up, right? So even ISIS, which people discount this. Like, there is other ways to win urban battles. You can convince the defender that it is to their advantage not to fight. ISIS actually evacuated cities in the battles of Iraq and Syria because they didn't want to hold the city, didn't want to die holding the city. So they would evacuate before the Iraqi security forces got there. But when you have a defender who says, I will defend this to my death, people think that, okay, but you should just let them hold the city for a couple of years until you can figure out another way. They're just not reasonable theories that have been proven with actual, it's almost like anti-intellectual, like, well, you should have tried this. Like, well, what makes you think that would have worked in any amount of time? Yeah, but you can wait a couple of years. It's crazy.
So I was reading former Secretary of Defense Gates's memoir, and one of the things that outraged him about Joe Biden was that all he cared about when it came to deciding military matters were the political ramifications. And so my first thought, well, is if he was ready to have American military decisions be slaves to political ramifications. Clearly, what would stop him in Israel's case? And I try to imagine. And by the way, as a Jewish American, I've been quite appreciative of Joe Biden in general, but nevertheless, I try to imagine in a cinematic kind of way what these conversations are like in the White House when the Israelis are there and they say you need to kill fewer civilians, and they say, well, how do you expect us to do that?
Yes.
And then they say some non-military person must say blah 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 the things that you're saying, because I imagine that our generals are going to agree with you. They know that they can't with a straight face give Israel this kind of advice unless one gets snarky and says, well, these are the same people who told us we could pull out of Afghanistan in this way, and so their expertise speaks for itself. I don't quite believe that. I think the Afghanistan thing was also driven by the politics. But I know very little bit about this kind of stuff. But I'm fascinated by it, and we really don't ever get any good reporting on it. You could just, I don't want to talk too much, but you could just imagine a very, very testy conversation between the Israeli prime minister and Blinken and saying, what are you talking about? You know goddamn well we can't do that. How do you expect us to win? Do these conversations happen? And what do the Americans answer?
So one, all war is politics, period. Like we
Mm-hmm.
teach that, when I taught military strategy at West Point, like if you really get, and there is no such thing as a war, a total war where the generals get to run the war whatever the way they want, politicians stay out of the way. All war is politics. We live in a globally connected world where every population gets to see the world and interpret it based on their expertise, or even somebody who has a little bit of expertise. I guarantee that those meetings happened. Those meetings of you got to reduce the civilian casualty count. Look, well, how? Well, just wait. Just don't do your operation in Rafah right now. Just wait. We'll figure out a way. Like, well, what do you think the way is? I can guarantee. And one of the challenges, Noma, I think is scary is when you believe that there are military personnel that know how to do it differently. When I'm telling you that this type of warfare hasn't, the US military has never done it. So who's the expert giving the best military advice? I told you that General Milley said that it would have gone a lot differently had it been the United States based on the political objectives provided to the military to pursue. But to understand that nobody has actually faced these challenges. And when you have people or guests to tell you, like, well, in this case, we didn't do that. Well, okay, the variables, well, the context was completely different. Matter of fact, you're talking about a single battle against a very small enemy in a very small city. And there are 24 cities in Gaza. There are 10 massive cities that would be 10 times what you're talking about in that single battle. Absolutely. And this is when I visited Nome. So I went into Khan Yunis, which is the last major operation the IDF was doing in Gaza in February with the division commander to see it for myself. I'm too am trying to find the truth. Like, look, the world says you're doing too much. Can I see your operations? And I got taken into the city with the division commander, and the things they were doing were exactly that. Where they were finding a way to clear urban terrain, to find tunnels, and to kill Hamas without killing any civilians. One of the examples I give people is when a division commander walked me through a single operation within the Battle of Khan Yunis, where they launched 3 brigades to surround 250,000 civilians, which they can track now by cell phones. And without firing a single shot, they surrounded them in the middle of the night, told them to evacuate through their lines, which I, as a military guy, was like, that's crazy. Like through you guys, not like through the safe area that there's no military, but through them, and set up giant facial recognition devices, and they picked out of 250,000 civilians they are now evacuating through their lines. 900 high-level Hamas combatants were picked out of that civilian crowd. So they figured out a way, because the world said they had to, slowly, methodically, week-long, to figure out a way to take that strategy of Hamas away, which is the civilian death perception of death in Gaza. So you're spot on. Those meetings have happened, and they started in
But
October.
So this phrase you said, it's again, it's something I thought you said because the world said they had to.
Yeah.
Now this is interesting because necessity becomes the mother of invention, and sometimes though the constraints were political and maybe based on the American election and whatever it is that you might want to criticize, if the result is that it caused Israel to quadruple its efforts to figure out a better solution, and actually there was some good solutions that were found, that in some way mitigates the criticism of what America did there, right? If it produced an ingenious way of finding these Hamas people through facial recognition and sparing lives, hard to argue with that.
It, I agree with you, but the goal of a military strategy is to achieve the goals with the least amount of cost. So, from the Israeli side, absolutely. And I've talked to Israeli people who don't understand how the IDF have prevented civilian casualties. Like they have this kind of dissonance, but they also fear within them. So you think about the hostages left in captivity now for this long, even though we know where they're at, the Hamas leadership staying in power. Because this way, so this is my fears. Like, yes, I think absolutely innovation is, necessity is the mother of all innovation. And they have, the IDF have figured out a way, given the context of the operation, to do it slower with less forces, less bombing, methodically, but it's required immense amount of time. And in wars, this is where people discount. Why did it take 9 months to take out 4,000, not 40,000, 4,000 ISIS fighters out of the city of Mosul? I can tell you why, because the security forces were dying a lot. It's a very tough challenge. But to think that time is always on, if you understand that war is politics, and this Hamas strategy of using inaccurate numbers to force, now you have universities protesting everywhere. Now you have U.S. administration say, we're not going to send you any more bombs to protect yourself from even Hezbollah in the north, who's attacking, and those munitions would be. Time is never a indefinite variable in a war. So yes, this way caused there to be, but also the context is different. This strategy that the IDF figured out in Khan Yunis would not have worked in Gaza City, where you had tens of thousands of enemy combatants under the ground resisting, and holding the ground. This is a strategy that worked in the context of the mission variables at the moment. And this is how everybody wants to talk about today, like it was October when the war started. With the number of bombs, the number of civilians, casualties, they just hold these things in constant without understanding all the variables that we're talking about. So, yes and no.
Well, also it came to my mind after I asked that Israel also has these hostages to consider,
100%.
and that puts a pressure on time that the enemy may not be entitled to the same consideration that it would be if they were not holding these hostages, because obviously every day that Israel is slower is every day that another hostage is suffering or dying. Which brings me to the question of international law and the hostages and common sense in a way. What is international law even left standing here, given that, in my estimation, the world has really come around to the opinion that the side that uses human shields is the side who needs to be considered, and that this is the royal flush strategy, and that if you don't bend and relent in the face of their using human shields, in other words, if the evil person uses human shields, the good guys are supposed to capitulate. Otherwise, they become evil themselves, in which case, all warfare now will be fought with hostages and human shields. So answer that, and then we'll get to the negotiation for the hostages, which I also cannot understand. But what is the current situation of international law after this?
Right. I think it's it's very precarious where you have a situation and where it isn't the law, but the perception of the law and the use of force, which drives people to say that you can't do the operation, right? This would,
Yeah.
and I agree with you, the sentiment, and this is what I've strongly said, that if Hamas's strategy works uh, to conduct an invasion of another nation, fall back into your civilian population with the intent to have as many of your civilians killed as possible while using hostages to get at the psyche of the other nation, if this isn't stopped, if Israel isn't able to defeat Hamas and this strategy, then you'll see it popping up everywhere. Hezbollah will try the same tactic. Other people in other countries will try that. This is the so what to, yeah, but Israel, you have more power. Just wait a few months, leave the hostages in captivity. The problem with international law, though, is that you have credible organizations, and begin because I have been studying this for years. I've seen the evolution of this, not what the law says, but what people of credibility say the law says. I think international law is, I want people to follow the law of armed conflict because it actually puts bounds on brutality, and we never go back to targeting civilians to try to convince their governments, their regimes, even evil, to give up. That's the bombing of civilian areas. That's the carpet bombing, the firebombing of Tokyo. I agree that the law has evolved to put limits on the brutality of war, but the law should never be developed to the point where you say, yeah, but you don't have the right to defend yourself. Just deal with it. That would be a really violent world we would then live in, because how many more people would view this as a very asymmetric strategy to achieve political goals? The law is there to put limits on the brutality of the law. But what we've seen is credible organizations within the United Nations and human rights groups interpreting the law and then nobody questioning them on that. I mean, in 2022, Amnesty International, who had some credibility, said it was illegal for the Ukrainians to be in the cities, the military to be in their cities that they're defending, because it's a violation of law to be intermixed with civilians. Like that's the level. And all these organizations, again, people don't understand the history of this. UNICEF, the United Nations High Commission of Human Rights Activists, have all been saying these things about anybody who follows the law of war, like the United States. For the Second Battle of Fallujah, the United Nations High Council of Human Rights said we targeted civilians, we massacred civilians on purpose, we violated all the laws of war without evidence. And then later, years later, the U.S. forces were cleared of that. But this is the world where we're now living in, that people who want no war want to say the law says, well, everything that Israel is doing is illegal, when it actually, in no way, shape, or form, Israel has gone above the law, given all the variables, and then implemented every measure that's ever been thought of. And like we talked about earlier, created new ones to prevent civilian casualties. But if anybody thinks there's ever going to be a war where there's zero casualties, and I've heard people, world leaders now saying this, the right number of casualties in Gaza is zero, civilian casualties. Well, then you want that means Israel cannot conduct a military operation in Gaza, because that's not what
Yeah.
the law says. The law says you do the proportionality, military necessity, you take all precautions possible, constant care to prevent civilian casualty. But the law never was meant to be developed to where you would ever fight a war and there would be zero civilian casualties. The number one law of war is don't target civilians, period.
I I know, and and there's so many war crimes going on here, and I understand in some way that we expect more from the quote unquote more civilized people. We expect more from Israel than we expect from Hamas, but it descends into just a total first just i- ignoring of the topic, and at some point people forget about it so much they begin to take Hamas's side without even realizing what they're doing here. You dismiss Hamas's responsibilities because you consider them barbaric, and then before you know it, you're taking the side of the barbarians and just forgiving everything they do. Every, as you said, every missile and rocket is a war crime. The fact that they don't wear uniforms to purposely make it impossible to tell who's a civilian and who's a combatant. The human shields, the tunnels. I mean, every single, the hostages, every single thing they do is a war crime, and this is all forgiven. And then tomorrow, Israel will commit, some jackass Israeli soldier or commander will order something which is a war crime, and the entire world will screech to a halt. Israel has committed a war crime because we no longer even care about the other side's war crimes. And I think I'm being fair here. I don't think I'm just speaking as a pro-Israel mouthpiece. I think this is a problem if you believe in morality.
Yeah, I mean, it's not only is it fair, it's backed up by all evidence that of these organizations that accuse Israel for doing wrongdoings, the none of them tell Hamas to stop violating the laws of war.
Right.
Barely, the United Nations calling out what happened on October 7th, the use of the hospitals, the use of the schools, the use of the UN facilities, the use of sexual assault against the not distinguishing themselves. And the great example I give of that is, again, the Russia-Ukraine war. The civilians partook in the activities. They turned themselves from civilians to combatants. But this is every picture you ever see of Ukraine, you see a civilian with a yellow or blue tape wrapped around their arm because they don't have a uniform, but they're trying to follow the laws of war and distinguish themselves. But not one of these organizations, with their accusations based on whatever report that they have, has called out Hamas daily for violating from attacking humanitarian aid ports of entry and gates to attacking civilians trying to, hoarding humanitarian aids, despite all the reports. But this is where you got to think that it's more than just about the law of war here.
Nothing seemed clearer to me than the fact that the administration was undercutting Israel's attempt and possibility of getting the hostages back when it was basically asking Israel to stop the military pressure in order to negotiate for the hostages. When it seemed as clear as day to me, after at first they had a surplus of hostages, and Israel's barrage was so overwhelming, I could imagine they traded some just to get a breather. We have plenty left over. Now they're down to their last batch of hostages, and they are not going to trade them except for their lives or for an Israeli surrender. And when America pressured Israel to stop the military action, why in the world would they think Hamas was going to release the hostages?
I don't know. No, it has been the psychological warfare against all of Israel is this hostage situation of where even their population like do anything possible to bring them home. One is understanding it's not a normal hostage negotiation, right? Hamas has a history of, why did Yahya Sinwar sitting in Israel's prisons develop this strategy of, well, if we take some prisoners, it'll put this situation in such a complexity that will always have an advantage, right? Israel has exchanged thousands of prisoners, Palestinian prisoners, for just a dead body of a single IDF soldier. This is understanding who we're negotiating with. But I agree with you. And, all the negotiation was theory. The biggest thing that has brought hostages home has been military pressure. And that there are kind of undeniable truths for both sides. Israel cannot allow Hamas to say in power in Gaza, or its literal existence will be threatened based on the words of Hamas, not an ideal, like an assumption. No, Hamas says since the war that if I survive this, October 7th was just a warm up, and I'm going to keep doing it until I get the job done. So, as a hostage negotiation first principle, you know that Hamas cannot stay in power. You also know that just extending this indefinitely cannot continue if you just understand that war is politics, that the United States and everybody else, the UN Security Council, like all those variables that Hamas, his strategy that we've been talking about has also been on time. Eventually, time will run out for Israel, for the world, and for the hostages, because God forbid how many hostages are still alive, but Israel still will do everything possible to bring hostage bodies home. And Hamas knows this. Why on earth did anybody think that Hamas would negotiate for hostages? it is right, but you have to try. I agree. You have to try by all. And if Hamas wants a couple more weeks to survive to try to achieve a victory, fine. But you have to go into the principle that nobody can force Israel to say the people who did October 7th get to survive in Gaza and remain in power, and you just have to live with that. Like that's putting a nation at risk.
Well, yeah, you have to try, but you have to, as I said, you have to try while you're making it clear. Listen, buddy, you're going to die. Take this deal because you're going to die. We're never going to let you stay in power. But instead, the Biden administration, they're obviously pulling, they'd be very happy. They would not be upset at all if Israel decided to let Hamas stay in power. And Hamas is seeing that and say to themselves, our strategy is working. Hold the line. I think we might actually pull this one out. Let's string them along with the hostages. I mean, the cynicism to offer 33 hostages in the first round, but we won't tell you how many of them will be corpses. And that the fact that the world that was not too much for the world to just say enough with Hamas already. How dare you this late in the game be playing such games? They still treat it deferentially. Oh, that's illegitimate. Oh, let's, keep the negotiation going. Nobody negotiates in good faith and makes that offer. It's obvious what they're doing. It's just very upsetting to me. Is it possible that behind closed doors there's somebody in the Israeli military or cabinet that says, look, the best way to get the hostages back is to fight as if there are no hostages?
No, I honestly don't think
No?
so. I mean, even if it was us, even if understanding this is again, how do you negotiate with evil? Period. Hamas is evil on earth. Now, if you're uninformed, you think Israel has evil intentions. Like, why do you think that? One, Hamas showed you it showed you in thousands of videos that they are evil to the core in their words. Even when you try to reason with evil and say, for the safety of your people, so that we can bring more humanitarian aid, you should do a temporary pause and give hostages. No, we don't care about our people. And they've said those words. They're not our problem. They're United Nations. I do believe, though, if you're the IDF, you absolutely have that at the very top of your principles, that you're trying to bring your people home, because this is the separation. Again, when I fought in the U.S. military, my family wasn't 2 miles behind me. I didn't know any of the hostages that were taken. This is the degrees of separation between the IDF and the hostages, or there's anybody who's suffered from October 7th. But that doesn't mean, and I say this as somebody who's done the research, that the IDF have this, let's just go kill them, let's just go get them. No, they're actually following a legal, ethical, moral code of who they are. So that applies to how they move forward to destroy Hamas, but also how they move forward with every action, thinking that there's a hostage in some type of situation in front of them.
Well, obviously, you know more about this than I do. It's just somehow the negotiations are psychological. Negotiating without leverage is begging, as I always say, and reminds me of one of these philosophy class scenarios of two cars driving head first into each other. Who's going to pull off the road first, and the solution is to take the steering wheel out of your car, throw the keys out the window so the other side knows you have no way of pulling off, and then the other side pulls off. And somehow Israel needs to convince Hamas, you're going to die. You are going to die, and then they will get serious about releasing the hostages. Maybe that's
Yeah, I don't
simplistic
even
on
think you
my
have to say
part.
that, right? It's just you're not going to remain in power. Like, would I be fine if they all unilaterally surrendered
Oh
and
yeah,
went
that's
in?
what I mean. The only way
Yeah.
you won't die is take safe passage out. Otherwise, you're going to die. Yeah, exactly. Sorry, I didn't mean to
Well,
interrupt you,
I
Carl.
don't think they can be. So, just so I'm clear, like
Yeah.
I don't think that Israel can make a deal where Hamas senior leadership just gets basically put into exile, because they still will have achieved this massive victory, and the threat that it would pose to Israel would be massive as well. And We haven't even
Oh,
talked about.
I think they would.
You think
I
so?
think politically
Okay.
they'd have no. Yeah, I think they would. But maybe they'd find a way to assassinate them years later. But I think the Israeli public would demand that.
Yeah.
Let them go to Tunisia or whatever it is. That's what I think. It may not be wise in the long term, but in the short term, I don't see how they could not take that deal.
Right, but this is for me the as a strategist, like how
Yeah.
does Hezbollah view that deal that Hamas survives the war?
And we're wrapping it up. If Hamas were to stay in power, I just want to make the point that, in my opinion, the lightning bolt of energy that would go through this cause and the entire Arab world, it would make the notion of a two-state solution almost impossible. If you believe, as most Israelis do, that the only reason the Palestinians will accept a two-state solution is because they feel they have no choice, not because they think it's just. They'll never think it was a just solution, but they will think it was the best they could get. But if they see Hamas win, then they will say to themselves, you know what? As I said before, let's hold on. We might win this thing. So why
100%.
accept two
And
states now? Go
100%.
ahead.
And you can't, if you want to put the Middle East in a constant state of war, let October 7th become Palestinian Independence Day. Let that be the vehicle which forces a two-state solution rather than a political process which many US presidents, Democratic and Republicans, have tried to broker, where both sides acknowledge each other's right to exist and to abandon terrorism. But if you want to put the Middle East and for massive amounts of human suffering to continue forever, let Hamas survive the war and let that become a forced two-state solution out of October 7th.
Um, I should have asked you this earlier, but it was brought to mind by something I saw on the Joe Rogan show where he was there was some video of Israelis killing some people
Yep.
that under what looked like questionable circumstances. We tend to view things through frameworks that we already understand, and I think quite often we view military footage within everything that we've learned about how police are supposed to operate vis-a-vis criminals. So you're never supposed to shoot a criminal in the back. If a criminal raises his hand, there's all sorts of rules about what you're supposed to do with a criminal if he's unarmed and all the rest. Is that a good analogy for how war is supposed to operate, or are there differences?
So that's just what we call a softball.
Let
Absolutely
the record
not.
show he's laughing at me. If you're listening, but go ahead.
um, Absolutely not. So I don't think that's the great tragedy of observing this war. I think the great tragedy is looking at this war from a counterinsurgency, counterterrorism framework, right? The idea that you're creating more terrorists by pursuing Hamas in this way, that you're not, protecting the population. It's all counterinsurgency. It's like saying, like the way you destroy the Nazi military matters because you're just turning more Germans into Nazis. It's not the framework in which you would look at a conventional war. Yes, the day after matters. And yes, Joe looked at that video in a more, I guess you could say, Western policing what is a combatant, right? So in my world, there are two things. There's a non-combatant and a combatant. And a combatant is anybody who's partaking in the hostilities as a member of a military force or in actual actions. So the ideal, which Joe says, and I'd love to talk to Joe about that. I really respect Joe Rogan's pursuit of knowledge. But one of the things he says in there is that not carrying a weapon, unarmed civilians. What you don't have to be carrying a weapon to be a combatant. Your actions before that video started could have put you in what you're doing, who you are. And again, I told you about the facial recognition. If you are Hamas, I can destroy you, period. Um, and if you're a member of the enemy force, I can destroy you no matter what you're doing because you're the enemy. You're the other combatant. And there are so many particulars in the law of war on what determines an act of hostilities or being a member of the military force. Whether it's you wearing a uniform, but you don't have to be carrying a weapon. You could have popped out of a tunnel. You could have been doing something before that. I could have facial recognition. I know exactly who you are. And now I have a point where I can take you out because you're walking in an open field. That is 100% legal, normal, everything. But this is where we live in a world where I can watch a video and go, clearly unarmed. They actually say kids, like they can tell what age those people are, like unarmed kids not carrying weapons, of course civilians, and Israel just took them out. Like I just by the watching the video and the use of a precision guided munition, Israel absolutely knew who those people were. And you would have to know, okay, what is the information you had about these individuals that you precisely attacked and killed? But agree, people want frameworks to view what they're seeing. And unfortunately, we live in a world where they don't have a framework. They're just making their own assumptions based on some type of experience. Or even if you have a veteran who's applying a counterinsurgency mentality. We destroyed the Taliban and removed them from power in weeks. We destroyed the Saddam regime and its military in weeks. After that, you're in a counterinsurgency, counterterrorism case. There is no counterinsurgency in Gaza. Hamas is still in power. You can't be fighting a counterinsurgency against the ruling authority. It's a war.
I'm sorry. There's so much. I'm so happy I had you on the show. You know, when I first we were first contacting. I don't know if you just heard that alarm. I said I didn't know your work. I did know your work. I saw you in Newsweek. This like something article like everything we know about Gaza is wrong or something like that. And I saw that article and I was astounded by that article. But somehow, respectfully, because it was Newsweek and Newsweek has had this transition from what it was to then what it wasn't to what it seems to be coming again, I really didn't know how to rate what you were writing. And it's not to the credit of our mainstream media that I didn't hear the things you were had written being echoed, on CNN or even the Atlantic or places like that. So I really didn't know how much to adopt what appeared to be an outlier opinion, even though it might be 100% correct. So I apologize for that. But I did know who you were, and I had read your article at the time when it came out in March, I think it was. The day after, Israel gets a lot of flack for not having a well thought out, clear day after plan, and this irks me, not because I wish they wouldn't have one. Of course, I want them to have one, but any day after plan has to have Hamas destroyed and out of power. So that's given. And B, I can't imagine in any war, let's say in Japan, if we couldn't have conceived of the day after plan, how that would be a knock on our fighting of the war. The fact is, and this is a business analogy, very often in my world, sometimes I purposely know it's almost futile to spend too much time figuring out what I'm going to do when I get to a certain point in time, because I know from experience, nothing is ever as I thought it was going to be anyway. But I know that I have an objective I have to pursue, and I pursue that objective. Israel is pursuing its objective. If it's going to have an Arab peacekeeping force, it needs Hamas destroyed because no Arab country is going to come in with that insurgency. If it's going to have the Palestinian Authority in charge, it's going to need Hamas destroyed because they took over Hamas took over from the Palestinian Authority once before in a coup. If it's going to be a military occupation, I mean, whatever it is, Hamas needs to be destroyed. So a long question. Is it fair to Israel to expect them to have a day after plan right now?
So I think it is. I think it is. I mean, Israel waged the war against Hamas. It knew it would destroy. It knew it would leave a vacuum of power. But this is the ideal that Israel hasn't thought through the day after. That it hasn't already taken steps to what even the security environment would look like the day after. And this is not true. Like I am not. I have again when I went and visited, I asked those questions, and they've actually presented and they've talked to the United States and other people about the challenges of the day after, what they're already doing with the increase of road networks, the cutting up into different networks. There's already like a Gaza security force, but who again trying to imply a counterinsurgency, counterterrorism framework on war. You're right. The day after in a war starts the day after, but people think that Israel is just not thinking about that, right? It's only focused on hostages and destroying Hamas. Doesn't give credit to the actual work being done, but also the complexity, right? There's already been conferences in Spain about what comes after Gaza. Israel wasn't invited to it. That's a challenge. But who is the other actor? Because when the United States has gone, there's always been somebody else, whether it was the right pick or not, that would be the coming in governing force. Then you'd work with all these different security forces. And yes, there are plenty of lessons that the United States learned after years of doing it wrong to establish local power structures, local security forces that want to actually secure their environments and pursue prosperity, concrete walls, all this stuff. I talked to General Petraeus on my podcast about this, but you have to give Israel credit. Yes, now they have done a crappy job of communicating that to the world. Absolutely, that they are working on the day after plan with both in security, but they have also with a foundational principle is Israel will not govern Gaza ever again. Period. It has to be a governing force in there. But it's not just an Israel problem. But where is Egypt? Where is Jordan? Where are the Arab nations on what that day after looks like? Right now, all they want to do is lobby accusations on the way Israel has pursued the destruction of Hamas, as in
Well,
there was a
that's
different
my
way.
that's my. We're kind of saying the same thing. I'm saying if you don't have Egypt on board, if you don't have the Palestinian Authority on board, if you don't have the Saudis
Oh,
on board, how can Israel offer a day after plan when it can't speak for these other actors who have to be involved in it? I mean, they can say we wish we'd love this to happen, but that's not a plan.
yeah, they can work towards establishing a security environment that creates the best conditions for another whatever it is.
Right.
And I wouldn't point to the Palestinian Authority if I were you as a viable person to be in Gaza, especially with their refusal to abandon terrorism, the slave for play, the pay for slave program that is vibrant in the West Bank and with Palestinian Authority. But this is Israel does own part of the process and is working to establish conditions that would lead to a better day after. Now they have done a crappy job on communicating that. I agree with you. While they're being attacked by Hezbollah, Iran, the Houthis, as they're trying to just to finish Hamas. So take it with a grain of salt. But yes, they you understand some of the challenges uniquely to what the day after could be in a world that has many approaches have been tried.
Is you think Israel should go into to get Hezbollah after they finish with Hamas? Think they have to do that?
There is no way Israel can continue without dealing with Hezbollah that is attacking daily since October 8th, and who there are 80,000 Israelis for over 6 months who are living in hotels and friends' houses because they can't go home. And I went to the north on my last trip and visited the Blue Line. In any other case, it would warrant a full scale defensive war. But Israel cannot achieve peace without having Israel dealt with in the north. I'm not saying that's only military force that has to be used, but the current level of attacks and situation with Hezbollah on the northern border, an existential threat, cannot continue.
And I really am wrapping it up now here. I had a thought. I don't know how into the politics you are. I'm really happy to talk to you. One of the thoughts I had recently was that if I was a Palestinian citizen on the West Bank, as bad as that situation I'm sure is, the indignities, the checkpoints, all of it, I would probably fear that the day we had our own state, it would descend into civil war. And I might very well make the calculation, as bad as this is, I prefer the status quo to what I would imagine would be the reality of an independent Palestinian state. And I think that might be some also something that goes on under the surface that makes a two-state solution more difficult. I'm not sure Abbas and people like him are that eager for a two-state solution.
Correct, or would have happened, right? So this is again, one of the biggest travesties that people don't know is that the United States forced an election on Gaza.
Yeah,
Hamas won that election by force. The Palestinian Authority said, not on our watch, not on the West Bank. And Hamas would have won an election in the West Bank had the Palestinian Authority said, not on my watch, and by force said no, and hasn't held an election since. I
right.
agree with you 100%. For the Palestinian people, the greatest ways that they never achieve peace is to allow Hamas to survive, allow the current strategies to continue. And I'm not absolving Israel, right? I know there are
No.
lots of complexities to this, but the if people think that the two state, it's almost literally diplomatic laziness to just keep using the word two-state solution, believing that that's the solution to the problem. And the fact that every
Yeah.
U.S. administration for decades have tried to pursue that with both whoever it is, Arafat, Abbas, Netanyahu, or whoever it is. Not, it isn't just those three actors. And they've
Yeah.
never been able to achieve that because of some very big first principles. Like, say I have the right to exist. Just say it. Just say that Israel has the right to exist or the Palestinian state, and that you will stop the terrorism program. I mean, it.
Well, I think they did say Israel had the right to exist, but they never actually changed the charter. I saw a New York Times article in 2014. Abbas wouldn't even respond to President Obama about his plans. I looked up today just before we started. This is interesting. The per capita income on the West Bank, not Gaza, is the highest of any non-oil Arab state. But by my look at it, a little bit higher than Jordan and Algeria and Egypt. And that's interesting to me. I had some Arabic friends echo this to me that they thought that it would be a lot of there would be a lot of bloodshed there. God forbid. So then the final question is: would you have dropped the atom bomb in Japan?
I wasn't ready for that one. Of course, I would have,
You
and
would have.
and
Okay.
of course, I would have to end that massive amount of suffering. And I also know that legally, the question has never been answered whether that was legal to do. But we would live in a much different world. I personally believe at that moment in time, had that not happened, we'd live in a much different world.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I'm not an expert on it. I tend to agree with you, but mostly because the people whose opinions I trust on most other matters have come to that conclusion, not because I've done the arithmetic myself. All right, sir. I really want to thank you. I don't know if you ever get to New York. You're at West Point, or you have been at West Point.
I work for West Point. I work remotely in Colorado.
So you're in Colorado. So if you ever get to New York City, I'd be very happy to meet you in person. I really appreciate you spending the time on this show. So thank you very much. Thank you very much.